Hello, welcome to the fourth part of the video lesson on the essay Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences by Jacques Derrida. In this last and final part of the lesson, we will look at the concept of free play. As we have already mentioned in the previous video, free play refers to the infinite substitution of signifiers within a structure. So we already mentioned that all structures seem to be controlled by a center, but actually the structures are characterized by the lack of a center. What we have in a structure is not a fixed center, but rather a lack of a center that gets substituted again and again. And the center is supposed to be that which controls all the elements, but because there is a lack, there is an inherent lack in the center, this makes the free play of the elements possible. Free play is made possible by the lack of a center, which necessitates supplementation by the addition of more and more signifiers. So you never reach a final signified or a transcendental signified that is beyond all signifiers, but rather because the center or this notion of a transcendental signified is empty, you keep on trying to fill it, to supplement it with more and more signifiers. Therefore, in the absence of a fixed center or a final signified, all that remains is a superabundance of signifiers. This is the term that Derrida uses, superabundance of signifiers. There are more and more signifiers, and it is superabundant. It is much more than what is necessary. And this free play, this excess of signifiers without a fixed center, results in what Derrida calls discourse, what post-structuralist thinkers called discourse, which is nothing other than the infinite play of difference and substitution that characterizes the process of meaning making. Now, having said this, towards the end of his essay, Derrida tries to think a bit more about free play and its relationship with history and with the philosophy of presence. First of all, he says free play is in tension with history. Its relationship with history is a tense one. History is supposed to be in opposition to teleological and eschatological metaphysics, but actually it is in complicity with such metaphysics. What does this mean? Teleological means it refers to a method of explaining phenomena based on the purpose that they serve rather than their causes. If you look at a phenomena and for example, you look at capitalism as it exists today, and then you see it in terms of what is the purpose served by capitalism, where is it going, where is it developing, rather than how did this come about. That is a teleological study. Eschatological means relating to final judgment, death, destiny, etc. These are teleological, and teleology and eschatology are aspects of philosophy. But Derrida says these are aspects of the philosophy of presence or the metaphysics of presence, because they look at what exists today and where it is going. It looks at a kind of development of a phenomenon rather than the causes or the conditions which set this phenomenon into motion, or what were the causes for this particular phenomenon. How did capitalism develop, or how did democracy, for example, develop? You look at any contemporary phenomenon, any contemporary structure, and you think about it not in terms of how it developed, what are the conditions that led to this, what are the absences, what are the other possibilities that were set aside in order to make this particular structure, whether it is capitalism or democracy or something else, in order to put this into the center. What are the other possibilities that were sidelined? Those are the things that history actually should be looking at, but history doesn't. Instead, history is also in complicity with such teleological and eschatological metaphysics, because history is imagined as a progression, an evolution, a process of becoming. Now, what does this mean? There is a way of imagining history that whatever happened in the past, in ancient times, was much less progressed, it was very primitive, and that history is a way of taking step by step in order to develop, in order to become more progressive, in order to become more modern, and what we have today is much better than what we had earlier. But there is always a question of whether that is actually true. First of all, whether it is true that history shows us that the modern is actually better than the medieval or the ancient. That is the first question. And secondly, is that even the right question? Whether the modern is good or bad, before we can reach that point, we should know how the modern came about, what are the circumstances that led to modernity developing in this particular way, and what are the other possibilities that were sidelined. Maybe there was an alternative modernity. We think that just because there was, for example, there was slavery in the past, and today we have democracy, today we have equality, so what everything that we have today should be good. But what if there was an alternative way of developing from that moment of slavery towards something else altogether? And we had, suppose maybe there was a better, more egalitarian society made possible with, that is different from what we have today. But we would never know that, because we don't look at the process of this becoming. Rather, we take this becoming for granted. We take this idea of development for granted. And history does that. History takes this idea of progression, evolution, becoming, development for granted, which it is not supposed to do. And by doing that, it is in complicity. In complicity means it is in cahoots with, or it is going along with this teleological and eschatological metaphysics. Now, looking at the work of Levi-Strauss, Derrida says that we can see in his work a respect for structurality which compels a neutralization of time and history. What is interesting about structuralists like Levi-Strauss is that by insisting on structurality, we should look at what structures exist today rather than looking diachronically at how things have evolved or developed across time. We should look synchronically at what kind of horizontal structures exist today and analyze them in the moment. By doing that, we are neutralizing, or we are removing the importance that we are given to time and history, because every new structure comes into existence precisely by means of a rupture with the past. Yes, you can say that it is a flow, time is a flow, history is a flow, and all structures have developed from previous structures. But if you look at the structure specifically, you will realize that every structure has always had a rupture, a break with the past. One example for that, again quoted by Levi-Strauss, is regarding the evolution of language. So, Levi-Strauss says that language must have been born in one fell sweep. In one fell swoop. That means that there was a certain point of time when human beings did not have language. Language meaning not just a specific language in which we communicate verbally or vocally, but the system of signification. To use a system whereby a particular word or a particular drawing or a particular sign refers to something else. So that is what we call language. And that there was a time when human beings did not use language, and then there was a time when human beings started using language. Now we all use language, we don't think too much about it. But how was language born? How did language first come about? And if you have studied linguistics, you would know that there is no consensus among linguists about how language came about. How did human beings start suddenly using language? We don't know. But Levi-Strauss says one thing that we should think about is that language cannot have been born progressively. It's not possible that maybe certain things started acquiring signification and certain other things didn't. The moment you use one sign, one symbol to refer to something else, then you are using language. So that means that there was a moment when there was no significatory process, there was no language, and then there was a moment when there was a significatory process, when there was a language. That with that one moment or that one element of signification, an entire possibility of language has been opened up. So this is what he means by a rupture or a break from the past. The moment human beings started using language to communicate, then human history is completely different from what it was before. Like that, every important paradigm or everything important that has happened in human history can be seen as a new structure that has broken away with the past. Therefore, when we look at things structurally, then we are questioning this idea of history as a continuous flow, a process of evolution and becoming. Next, and connected to this, Derrida goes on to say that free play is also in tension with presence, the metaphysics of presence. And what is presence? I have a quote from Derrida here. The presence of an element is always a signifying and substitutive reference inscribed in a system of differences and the movement of a chain. So, presence is basically the idea that there is something central, a fixed center that controls this particular structure, and that the substitutions of center for center are actually a kind of development, a kind of evolution, rather than necessitated by a lack at the center of that structure. So the idea of presence imagines that the center exists, the center controls all the structures, and the center evolves slowly into something else like that, and that is how history goes on. And so that is the complicity between history and the metaphysics of presence. However, free play is the disruption of presence, because free play, according to Derrida, is the condition of the possibility of absence or presence and not the other way around. Whether presence is possible at all is conditioned, or that is determined by free play, because what we have actually is the free play of elements, and in that free play of elements, it is the free play of elements which is necessitated by an absent center, which again leads to substitution, because when the elements keep playing around too much, then you need something else to control it, and the awareness of this lack of center becomes too much, and then some element keeps on trying to substitute it. So free play is what makes the substitution possible, and the substitution is what we imagine to be presence. It is not really presence, it is just an illusion of presence, but even that is made possible because of free play. Now, having said all this, Derrida goes on to say that even in Levi-Strauss's work, we can see an ethic of nostalgia for origins, which is an ethic of presence itself, which means that the Levi-Strauss knows and he says that origins are impossible. The origin is absent. For example, when he talks about the myth, he says that it is impossible to find the original myth which gave birth to all the other myths. The origins of myths are shrouded in mystery. We will never be able to find them. Similarly, for any structure, the origin of that structure can never be traced back. But at the same time, as this awareness of the impossibility of tracing an origin, the lack of an origin, etc., there is a kind of nostalgia for that impossible origin. We don't know what is that origin. It is somewhere in the past. We imagine that it is somewhere in the past, but there is a nostalgia for a time when an origin was possible. So the origin is absent, but there is an impossible or lost presence of this absence. The very absence of the origin itself creates the presence of nostalgia. So there is a certain element of presence in absence as well. Earlier, at some point, we mentioned presence as being characterized by absence. When we talked about history, for example, we said that whatever is present today, a particular political system like democracy, that is conditioned by many other absences. It is in the absence of many other possibilities, many other systems, many other directions in which we could have gone. All those are absent. But what we have today, the presence of what we have today, is also characterized by the absence of all the things that we do not have today. This is very simple. It is like the structuralist saying that the meaning of a particular word is in opposition to or in relation to everything else that the word does not signify. Meaning is based on difference. Just like that, any particular structure that exists today, its presence is conditioned by its absence. Similarly, when we say that the origin is absent or the center is absent, there is, whenever we say that it is absent, we will have a kind of nostalgia for that absent center. We will have this wish or this desire that, oh, if only it was present. So the lost presence of the center or the impossible presence of that origin coexists with its absence. So there is absence in presence and presence in absence. But having said this, now how do we move forward? Once we acknowledge the impossibility of accessing the lost or absent center, there are two ways forward to conceptualize structurality. There are two ways forward for philosophy and for the human sciences. And Derrida says that these two can be divided in the following way. The first is the negative, which he associates with the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The second he calls the affirmative, which he associates with the German philosopher Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. What are these two? The negative way or the negative possibility refers to the sad and nostalgic turning towards an absent origin or an absent center, as can be seen in structuralism, as can be seen in Levi-Strauss. And this possibility, this way of interpretation, seeks to decipher a truth or an origin without free play. So the idea is that right now we have only free play, we have no center, we have no origin. But somewhere we possibly had, somewhere lost in the mist of time, we possibly had a time when there was a center. So now we have the lack of a center, which means that at some point there was a center. So we have a kind of lost, we have a kind of sad, nostalgic turning back towards that impossible origin or center. So the idea is that there is actually some fixed truth. It's just that we cannot find it now. There is actually some origin, but we cannot access it now. It is lost somewhere. So free play exists, but beyond free play or without free play, there was or there exists somewhere that final center, fixed center, or an origin or truth, which however we are unable to access. And because it exists and we are unable to access it, we feel nostalgic, we feel sad, and this is what he calls the negative interpretation. It is negative precisely because it is sad and nostalgic. There is something which we know only by its absence, and we are sad about that absence. In opposition to that, we have the affirmative stance, which Derrida associates with Nietzsche, which is basically a joyous affirmation of the world of free play without truth or origin, and which aspires to go beyond the human. The first one, the negative one, is humanistic, whereas the affirmative one is something that says human is not very important. So today we talk about post-humanism and all that. So maybe we can connect these two. The idea of the Nietzschean affirmative, this way of interpreting the world, which is not centered on the human. Only if it is centered on the human do we feel sad that we cannot access that lost center. But rather we say that the human is not very important. Instead, what we have is we just have free play today. Maybe there was a center at some point, maybe there never was, it doesn't matter. We don't care about what is the ultimate truth. We don't care about what is the ultimate fixed center. We don't care about the origins. We know that we live in an unstable world where all the structures are unstable. They can change at any moment because of the free play of elements, and we are cool with that. We are fine with that. we affirm, we joyously affirm. Not only are we accepting of that, we are joyously affirming the free play of elements. We are happy that structures are like that. So that is a second possibility. Now, again, what is interesting is that Derrida does not tell us to choose between these two positions. He says there are these, once we know or once we acknowledge the impossibility of accessing that absent center or that lost center, then there are these two possibilities through which we can move forward in interpreting philosophy, in interpreting any of the human sciences. But he does not say that we have to choose one over the other. He's not saying let us choose the affirmative over the negative or the other way around. He says such a choice is actually impossible. The field of the human sciences is shared by these two contradictory approaches. Even though the two approaches are contradictory, they coexist. They exist together in the field that we call the human sciences, whether it is philosophy, whether it is literature, whether it is any of the social sciences, ethnography, anthropology, whatever we consider to be the human sciences, it has this simultaneous coexistence of these contradictory approaches that is inherent to the human sciences. At the same time, you know that the center is absent, you do have a yearning or a nostalgia for it, but at the same time you can also, even while bearing that some elements of that nostalgia in your mind, you can still continue to joyously affirm free play. So that these two possibilities, maybe there are different thinkers who are associated with these two possibilities, but sometimes even within each of us these two possibilities coexist. Therefore, a choice between these two interpretations is impossible, but rather these two interpretations of interpretations, these two interpretations of philosophy, of the human condition, of human life, exist simultaneously. Now we have come to the end of the essay, so we will just very quickly summarize the most important points made by Derrida in this essay. Structures depend on the notion of a center. All structures depend on the notion of a center, and it is a center that controls the elements and restricts their free play. So every structure has a center, and these elements are controlled by the center. That is the very idea of a structure. It has existed from time immemorial. It is very much a part of philosophy itself. However, we have not always looked at it in very great detail. The study of the structurality of the structure, how exactly such structures work, is conducted when structuralism as a theoretical movement comes into play. And structuralism realizes that, however, the center is neither within nor outside the structure. The center is not the center. Therefore, all structures are acentric. The center controls all the elements, therefore you can say that it is within the structure, but the center itself is controlled not by any element within the structure, but by something outside the structure. So you can say that the center is outside the structure. Therefore, the center is neither inside nor outside. We have already mentioned this, and I hope this is clear, that the center exists but it doesn't exist at the same time. Therefore, all structures are acentric. And what we have in place of a center is rather a function. It is not an actual space or an actual element, but rather a function, something that holds all these elements together. And that something, what exactly that something is, always keeps on changing, because the center is the locus, it is the location of infinite substitutions. The challenge before the human sciences is to find an acentric language to analyze these acentric structures. Acentric means without a center. So all structures are acentric. Therefore, the language that we use to analyze them should also be acentric. But the problem facing the human sciences is that the only tools that we have to criticize the metaphysics of presence are the very tools created from this metaphysics of presence themselves. And by tools, Derrida means the concepts, the frameworks, the theories, etc. of Western philosophy itself. These same concepts are all that we have in order to critique or challenge or deconstruct Western philosophy. But we cannot throw away those tools either, because we don't have any other tools. We can't throw it away. So Derrida says once we come to this problem, there are two possibilities. One is to throw away those tools, to step outside philosophy and try to critique philosophy, but that is impossible. Stepping outside philosophy is a very good idea, but practically, how do you do that? The moment you think that you are stepping outside philosophy and you say anything, it sounds like you are you will always come back within philosophy, because when you philosophize, when you talk about philosophy, when you interpret, all these are actually aspects of philosophy themselves. So even challenging philosophy is uh, a, is within the limits of philosophy. So stepping outside philosophy is not a possibility. Then what is the other possibility? And this is where, drawing upon the work of the cultural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, he gives us this method called bricolage. Bricolage is a method whereby we can use these same tools or concepts for their methodological value without necessarily believing in their ontological value, in their truth value. So you use them for their use value without believing in their truth value. And use them as long as they are useful, and discard them when they are no longer useful or valuable. And as an example, Derrida mentions Levi Strauss talking about the opposition between nature and culture in his book, The Elementary Structures of Kinship, where he's studying different kinship societies. And the incest taboo, the incest prohibition, is something that causes him to challenge the accepted division or binary between nature and culture, which is the very foundation of the science called ethnology, within which he works. And the opposition between nature and culture is very important. For it's an important basic fundamental aspect of philosophy itself. So when he encounters that, how does he go forward from there? Initially he is very confused about what to do, but then he comes up with this idea of bricolage, where he says that I will think of this opposition just in terms of its use value. So long as this opposition is useful, I will use it. But the moment that opposition becomes useless, as when I confront something like the incest prohibition, which seems to be beyond this opposition, then I will no longer use this opposition. I will discard it and I will use something else to understand that particular phenomenon. So that is an example of how Levi Strauss uses bricolage as a method. From this, he goes on to talk about how the method has to match the object that we are studying. If we are studying acentric structures, and all structures are acentric, then we need an acentric language to study it. And he talks about the example of Levi Strauss talks about the example of studying myths in South America, and how there is no way of totalizing. There is an impossibility of totalization, and there are different ways of understanding this impossibility of totalization. One way is to say that there is just too many myths, so we will never be able to get the totality. But according to both Levi Strauss and Derrida, the more important way of looking at it, or the more revelatory way of looking at it, is to say that myths cannot be totalized, not because they are too many, but because they are ever changing. They keep changing. There are as many myths as there are people who tell those myths, and there are as many myths as every time you tell a myth, it will change a little bit, because myths are orally told, and their origins or their centers cannot be found. So the language that is used to describe myths should also be mythomorphic. And the very process of describing myths can itself be called mythopoetic. These are all points that are made by Levi Strauss. And Derrida is telling us all these things to show that it, the post-structuralist is faced by this particular dilemma that all structures are acentric, but at the same time, we have a certain nostalgia for that lost or absent center. Structures are characterized by a lack of origin, but this lack of origin itself arouses in us a nostalgia for that lost or absent origin. So, the post structuralist rupture, which he is talking about from the very beginning of this essay, this rupture simultaneously involves a nostalgia for an absent center as well as a joyous affirmation of free play caused by the lack of a center. And this is how he describes the post structuralist rupture in his essay, Structure, Sign, and Play, in the discourse of the human sciences. Thank you.